It's working. That should be up now. Everyone can see that. Okay, great. And I'll just track my own time. Um, as Christy mentioned, I am a historian of Taiwan and China, and I help run the University of Washington Taiwan Studies program. I will give a short 30-second spiel about this. We run public events, which are open and tailored for everyone here in the audience. If you're interested in learning more about our events or attending, all of our events are in person and live stream, so you can join via YouTube or Facebook. You can follow our Facebook page. You can also join our mailing list, which is on our website. I think it's jsis.washington.edu/Taiwan. Okay, so today I will give first I'll start with a brief history of Taiwan. Those of you who have seen my talk before, I will ask for your patience as you go through. I'll try to make it as quick as possible. Taiwan history in 5 minutes. We'll go through Taiwan's relationship with China, with the United States. This will have some newer material. I'll discuss a couple things about economic ties, and then I'll end with a couple thoughts about the future of Taiwan's place in the world and Taiwan in the international system. Okay, so I'll start off with where is Taiwan? So here, Taiwan is encircled here in orange. It's an island off the coast of China, south of Korea and Japan, north of the Philippines, located roughly in the Western Pacific Rim. Population about 23.5 million people. The land mass is about a quarter of the size of the state of Washington, which is, it's an island. It's not that large. It's not like Greenland, but it's not that small either. So it's a mid-sized island. Taiwan is a thriving democracy, as I'm sure many of you know, by Freedom House, which is an NGO that does rankings of how free different countries are in the world. By Freedom House's rankings, Taiwan is ranked consistently in the very top echelon of kind of free, liberty, democratic countries. And so we'll talk a little bit about how Taiwan got there. And I'd like to start first with a breakdown of Taiwanese society. What does it mean to be Taiwanese? And I'll start first on the right-hand side of this chart, breaking down Taiwan's population, with 2% of Taiwanese people today are indigenous Taiwanese. And so these are people who have been living on the island of Taiwan for thousands of years. According to one theory, they've been living there for over 5 millennia. And so the indigenous Taiwanese are broken down into different groups of people. Each of these has their own mutually unintelligible language. And so you see some of the breakdowns here. Many of these groups do not exist anymore. They've been fully integrated into what is considered the main Han Taiwanese ethnicity. But many of these groups still exist today. So, for example, the Atayal, the Amis, the Paiwan groups still exist today as communities and still practice their own customs and languages. And we can talk more about indigenous Taiwanese culture if you're interested in Q&A. So I move now to the left-hand side. 98% of Taiwanese are what considered part of the Han ethnicity, which is the same kind of ethnic group that is the majority of Chinese people within China. And if you go further down, break it down a little bit further, you'll see that it breaks down to 15% Hakka, 70% Hoklo. And this is kind of referring to where these Han people originally migrated from in China. So Hakka people are spread throughout southeastern China. Most of them came from Guangdong province to Taiwan. And the Hoklo are mostly speakers of what's called Southern Min, and they come from southern Fujian. How did all those people arrive from China to Taiwan? And so for this, we have to go back about 400 years to the 1600s when the Dutch, under the Dutch East Indies Company, occupied Taiwan as part of their larger kind of colonial trading network. And so the Dutch arrived in the 1600s, and they're trying to enter into the very lucrative trade with China for silk, tea, porcelain. And what they want to do is they want to build up an economic base in Taiwan. So they want to be sure that they can support their local fort, which is called Fort Zealandia. And in doing so, they encouraged the migration of laborers because the Dutch, they arrive, there are not that many of them, a few hundred. And so they need a lot of laborers to help to till the lands and to produce things like sugar that they can then sell back to China. And so what they did is they gave all these incentives for Chinese to migrate across the strait to settle in Taiwan, mostly on land that they've taken away from indigenous peoples, in order for the Dutch to then tax them and then to gain a sort of revenue that they can then use to fund their colony. And so this is what one scholar, Tonio Andrade, is called co-colonization, because it was a colonization both by the Dutch as well as a colonization by and Chinese laborers who migrated across the strait and stayed in Taiwan. So the Dutch were the first European power to colonize Taiwan, but they weren't the last. And you'll see here that a number of different empires colonized Taiwan throughout its history, beginning with the Dutch, the Spanish very briefly. They were then both, or the Dutch were evicted by Gong, better known as Koxinga, who was often called a Ming loyalist. He was an official of the Ming Empire who wanted to restore the Ming Empire after it was overthrown by the Qing Empire. Then the Qing dispatched a navy to defeat Gong's successors, and so Taiwan became a part of the Qing Empire for about 200 years. Then the Japanese, after the Second Sino-Japanese War, took over Taiwan as a colony, and then finally, in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, Taiwan was a part of the Republic of China under nationalist rule. So going back to this breakdown of Taiwanese society, we see this very last section is what's called Mainlander, about 13% of Taiwan's population. And these are folks who came with the nationalist government, most of them in 1949, so a few years after Taiwan was integrated into the Republic of China. And they're called mainlanders because most of them came from the Chinese mainland. And this is part of a period on Taiwan called the Republic of China period, um, where Taiwan uh, it kind of became synonymous with this idea of China. And I'll talk more about this. Um, in 1949, something big happens, which is the nationalists who are in charge of the Republic of China lose in a civil war to the Chinese communists. And so there's a successful resolution. The revolution brings to power the Chinese communists, and they establish the People's Republic of China on the Chinese mainland. Now, the nationalists who lose to the Chinese communists retreat across the strait to Taiwan, and they're led by Chiang Kai-shek, and they set up essentially a government in exile where they claim that they're continuing to run the Republic of China, but really they only have control over a small part of China, which is the island of Taiwan and a few of these smaller outlying islands. When they're on Taiwan, they begin this process, a very kind of top-down, authoritarian, uh, muscle-bound process of sinicization, basically um, convincing Taiwanese people that they were in fact Chinese. And they did this through a number of different kinds of official programs, through education, through cultural programs. So, for example, teaching Chinese high culture like Beijing opera, and also mandating the use of standard Mandarin, which was then the national language of the Republic of China, in Taiwanese schools. And so most Taiwanese at that time didn't speak Chinese. They spoke at home Southern Ming, Mingnan, or they spoke Hakka, or many of them actually spoke Japanese because of Japanese rule. And they also taught that Taiwan was a part of Chinese history for thousands and thousands of years. This led to the notion that, Taiwan was the one true China. And it kind of led to a long, decades long diplomatic dispute between the government in Taipei, in Taiwan, and the government in Beijing, both governments claiming to represent China. And so there is this idea that for quite a long time that there was only one China. The United States, until 1979, recognized the Republic of China on Taiwan as China. And after 1979, it recognized the PRC. And so today, Taiwan is in this kind of nebulous state where officially it claims it is the Republic of China, even though, you know, Taiwan today does not claim any part of China, what we know as China today. Um, And it can't claim that it's Taiwan officially because Beijing opposes the use of Taiwan on its own terms. And so there's this really complicated political situation where um, Taiwan is the Republic of China, and there's a lot of history behind that. So I don't want to spend too much time about that. We can talk more about that in Q&A as well. I do want to emphasize, though, that under TSMC rule, Taiwan was ruled under a very strict period of martial law from 1947 um, more or less continuously for 40 years until 1987. Taiwan was ruled under a single party state. So the Kuomintang, the nationalist government, ruled Taiwan. It cracked down on all sorts of political and civil liberties. So there was no freedom of press, there was no freedom of speech, no freedom to congregate. Um, any kind of speech that was determined to be, kind of anti-government speech was considered treasonous and resulted in imprisonment, sometimes lifetime imprisonment, and sometimes even just outright execution. And so this was a period called the White Terror for those 40 years. In the 1980s, Taiwan underwent democratization. So there was a great deal of activism, and Taiwan relatively peacefully transitioned from a single party state to a multi-party democracy, which it continues to be today. And simultaneous with this process of democratization was also a process of decolonization. And what this means is there was this process of dealing with and reckoning with the 40 years of authoritarian rule, the 40 years of sinicization, where many Taiwanese began to think about how to address the kinds of human rights abuses that occurred under martial law. And you see here a picture of a widow. Her husband was one of these political dissidents who was killed during the February 28th uprisings in 1947 that marked the beginning of martial law in Taiwan. Along with decolonization, we have also changes in social identity, where Taiwanese people, beginning in the 1980s, really began to change their thinking about how they identified themselves. And this is a process that's sometimes called Taiwanization. This is kind of best reflected in political polls. So since 1992, National Zhenzi University, based in Taiwan, they have an election study center that runs these polls every twice a year. And they ask a really simple question. Do you identify yourself as Taiwanese, as Chinese, or as both? You can see in 1992, this green line, people who identify as Taiwanese and only as Taiwanese, in 92 was a really small number of the population, so 17.6%. That's on the left-hand side of this chart. Today, in 2023, this was last done in June, 63% of Taiwanese consider themselves to be Taiwanese and only Taiwanese. And people consider themselves to be Chinese and only Chinese dropped from 25% in 1992 to now under 3% in 2023. And so you can see this is a dramatic shift in identity and is one of the main driving forces in both kind of Taiwanese social change and also Taiwanese politics. You see this with recent social movements. So about 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago now, there was a major student-led movement called the Sunflower Movement. And this was in the kind of waning years of the Ma Ying-jeou administration. So President Ma Ying-jeou was then a KMT Kuomintang president, and he was signing or pushing into law a cross-strait trade agreement. So this would have been a trade agreement, something similar to NAFTA for North America, to bring Taiwan closer to China economically. And the way it was brought through the legislative yuan, which is the kind of equivalent of the US Congress, was done in a way that kind of tried to skirt, kind of legal and democratic processes. They tried to kind of push through this law without giving it proper public review. And it prompted a significant kind of public uh, protest, especially from Taiwanese youth. And so lots of students came out to occupy the legislative yuan and eventually force the government to withdraw the bill and kind of collapsed this trade agreement. The result of this is that many scholars of Taiwan have argued that the relationship between Taiwan and China is one that is contested. Shirley Lin, who is a political scientist in Taiwan, has this quote, which I think is really accurate. Over time, Taiwanese have come to regard Taiwan as a community whose interests should be promoted, and more have come to view China as the other that challenges those interests. So this has become a kind of antagonistic relationship. And you see this reflected in the political landscape. So currently, the president of Taiwan is President Tsai Ing-wen. She's serving her second term, which will come to an end quite soon next year. And we're actually coming up on an election year in January. She's from the Democratic Progressive Party, so this is sometimes called the DPP for short. The DPP arose from democratization in the 1980s. So this was the party that formed out of the democracy protests. They had their roots in what was called the Dangwai movement. Dangwai means outside of the party. And the party at that point meant the Kuomintang, the nationalist party. And so this is a party that had deep roots in Taiwan's democratization movement, and generally is seen as a more pro-Taiwan party, meaning that their kind of policy platform is they want to assert greater sovereignty for Taiwan. They assert that Taiwan is already an independent country, and what they mean by that is that it already has a kind of status quo independence. It operates its own military, operates its own police, it elects its own leaders. Um, it has exclusive use, what Max Weber calls exclusive use of the. Oh, I'm sorry, this is Charles Tilley, exclusive use of violence within their bounded territory. So the DPP is seen as more pro-Taiwan and less pro-Beijing. Uh, the candidate that the DPP has put up for the next presidential elections is the current vice president, Lai Ching-te, also known as William Lai. And he's seen as someone who largely follows Tsai Ing-wen's kind of policy platform. And so it's not particular. I would say personally, it's not particularly radical. It's actually a fairly moderate platform, and it continues a lot of how the DPP has ruled in the past 8 years under or 7 years under Tsai Ing-wen. Now, the main opposition party, so Taiwan is mostly a two-party system. And I'll talk about, there's an asterisk next to that. I'll talk about why I say mostly in just a couple minutes. The other main party is the Kuomintang, uh, KMT for short. This is the same party that ruled Taiwan under martial law for 40 years, and the same party that ruled the Republic of China basically since 1912. And so this is a party with a lot of history in China. Today, it runs fully as a political party within a multi-party democratic system. It competes in elections. It looks a lot like the Democratic or the Republican Party in the United States. Um, However, there are some caveats, and we can talk more about that too. The Kuomintang in general is more pro-Beijing, so their foreign policy emphasizes that they want to maintain a peaceful relationship with Beijing, and the best way to maintain a peaceful relationship with, sometimes an adversarial partner is to be on very friendly terms with them. So you don't want to rock the boat. You want to, buddy up and make sure that your 2,000-pound gorilla neighbor is happy with you. And so that's their basic foreign policy platform. The Kuomintang has nominated Hou You, who most recently was the mayor of New Taipei City. And his background was as a bureaucrat, actually as a police officer, and he rose up the ranks to become a police chief. Hou is considered to be a fairly moderate candidate. He has a moderate perspective. His own background is that he comes from a Taiwanese family, so not a so-called mainlander family, which is usually historically as represented in most KMT candidates. And so he's seen as someone who has a wider appeal to the Taiwanese public. The previous KMT candidate, the one who ran against Tsai Ing-wen in 2020, was Han Kuo-yu, who ran on a much more kind of radical populist platform, almost a kind of Trump make Taiwan great again platform. And
Good
so
to hear
that
this.
was a little bit unusual in that in the beginning of his campaign, what was really popular. You kind of rode a wave of popularity, but it crashed very soon afterwards. And so I think the KMT has chosen a different route for the 2024 elections in Hoyoi. They've chosen a candidate who is a little bit more moderate and has what they perceive to be a broader popular appeal as opposed to more um, conservative appeal. Now, I mentioned that there was an asterisk in my characterization of Taiwan as mostly a two-party system. And that's because we have the introduction of third parties in Taiwan's electoral system. Now, there's always been third parties in Taiwan dating back to democratization. Most of those parties have tended to align with the two main parties. So they've tended to be part of what's called a pan-green, green being the color of the DPP, or pan-blue, blue being the party, the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. Recently, there's been parties that have taken less of a pan coalition kind of approach. They've staked out more of a unique position. Some of these have arisen after the Sunflower Movement, and many of them had their roots from these student activists. And some of these have arisen independently of that. So you see here in 2016, 2020 that green and blue represent the DPP and the KMT, and there are a couple dots that are independent, so gray, but most notably there is what is that color? Orange and yellow. And so we'll talk about some of these. One of these is the Taiwan People's Party, the Minzhongdang. And the most prominent politician in the Taiwan People's Party is previously Taipei Mayor Ko Wen-je, who is a doctor by profession and then ran for office and turned into a political career. He is now running in the Taiwan presidential elections under his party, the Taiwan People's Party. And this is an interesting turn of events because Taiwan has mostly been a two-party system. In the past elections where there has been a third candidate, we've seen a split of votes that tends to kind of throw things around. And so the very first DPP candidate who became president essentially in the 2000s was elected because of a split in the KMT that split the kind of blue votes into two different candidates and allowed for essentially to come to power. And Ko Wen-je, I think, will have an effect on that because he's taken kind of a center position that will draw some votes away from the KMT. Most interestingly is most recently in the past month or so, there's been an announcement of a fourth presidential candidate, Terry Guo. Terry Guo is best known as the CEO of Honghai, which in the United States is better known as Foxconn. Foxconn is the major OEM, the assembler of Apple's iPhones, and a number of other Apple products are also assembled by Foxconn. So Terry Gou is a very rich Taiwanese billionaire, businessman, someone who has excellent name recognition because he's very well known in Taiwan, and originally ran as or wanted to run as a KNC candidate. He didn't win the primary kind of um, there wasn't an open election, but there was a committee selection. He wasn't selected to be the KMT candidate, and so now he's declared as an independent. And most likely, with a four-way split, we're going to see a really interesting electoral dynamic where a lot of the KMT side of the spectrum will be split amongst three candidates. And I think that what this means is most likely it's going to lead to a victory for Lai Qing, the DPP candidate. I think that's my prediction. We'll see. Okay. Um, I wanted to mention something else, which is there is this interesting crossover between popular culture and the election. If you might have seen in the news that there's this Netflix show called Wavemakers, which is subtitled in English, so you can watch it if you have a Netflix subscription. Wavemakers was a hit Netflix TV show, and I have to say, personally watching it, it's really good. I would characterize it as somewhere in between West Wing and House of Cards. So it has elements of idealism and realism that comes out of the Sorkin-esque kind of political tradition, but also has elements of kind of like dark politics that comes out of the House of Cards tradition as well. I shouldn't say tradition, but the House of Cards model. Wavemakers is it's a fictional kind of TV show, but it's about a hypothetical presidential election, and it shows the workers of a political party, and it's really good because it's really accurate. It tends to depict how political parties are actually run from the inside in Taiwan, and there are some elements that are uh, when it first came out, one of the major plot lines was around sexual harassment and sexual assault, which is a part of Taiwanese politics. And about maybe 6 months after it came out, it actually triggered or inspired a wave of um, uh, actual accusations that sparked kind of Taiwan's Me Too movement. And so this is one of those instances where kind of fiction leads to reality. And so it's not only interesting from perspective of understanding Taiwan's electoral politics, but also understanding how popular culture informs social perspectives about gender and about sexual crimes and about politics. And so if you're really interested in that aspect, I highly recommend the show and I highly recommend reading some of the articles that have come out after these allegations have emerged. Okay, yeah, and this is one of the articles that was covered in the New York Times, and the LA Times also has an article about this as well. Okay, let me check on the time. Okay, we're making good progress. So I want to move on now onward to Taiwan's relationship with China, with the People's Republic of China. Um, you've probably seen in the headlines, Taiwan is the most dangerous place on earth. Is Taiwan next? Meaning, is the next war going to occur in Taiwan? And last year, August 2022, Nancy Pelosi, then she was Speaker of the House, visited Taiwan, and it triggered a bunch of missile launchings from the PRC. So Beijing ordered a number of missiles launched in response to Pelosi's visit, and some people have called this the fourth straight crisis. There were a number of straight crises in the past decades where Beijing has taken particularly aggressive military action in response to political events that it found um, threatening. And so this was a major thing that happened in 2022. What explains this? Well, historically, Beijing has seen Taiwan as a part of the Chinese nation. And ever since 1949, has basically claimed that Taiwan is a part of China and it needs to be unified with China. And so almost every year, Chinese officials, I mean, almost on a daily basis, Chinese officials will reiterate this territorial claim on Taiwan. And so you can see in Xi Jinping's own words, this is from October 2021, no one should underestimate the Chinese people's staunch determination, firm will, strong ability to defend national sovereignty and territorial integrity. The historical task of complete reunification of the motherland must be fulfilled and will definitely be fulfilled. So this has led many Taiwan scholars to basically understand that this position is one of nationalism, where nationalism has become a core kind of governing ideology of Beijing, especially since Xi Jinping has come to power. So the past, especially the past 10 years or so, nationalism has taken a really central role in Beijing's domestic and foreign politics. We see this with Beijing's relationship with Hong Kong, where they've passed an authoritarian national security law in response to the Hong Kong protests that were occurring about 20, what was that, 2016. Um, and this has been a part of US China Taiwan relations as well. Um, Political scientists of the United States and China have argued that Taiwan exists in this triangular relationship with the other two parties, where when one leg of the triangle is in a particularly hostile period, the other legs will position of strength. So we're seeing a period. The U.S.-China relationship is extremely tense, or the Chinese-Taiwanese relationship is extremely tense. And so inversely, what we expect to see is that the US-China relationship is increasingly strong, and that seems to be the case. And the inverse has been true in the 1990s when the US-China relationship was growing closer and closer, that the Taiwan relationship with the United States was becoming more frigid. Um, and this has led to calls of, from Beijing's perspective, they see this as the United States using Taiwan as a pawn for its own strategic interests. So we can talk more about that as well. Um, I want to talk about two cases that kind of illustrate how the politics between the United States, Taiwan, and China are complicated by their economic relationship. And so we have this idea of tensions amidst a fairly close economic relationship between China and the United States. And so, can economics help to temper that relationship? Taiwan is an economic powerhouse. It came up from an agricultural, basically backwater, to become one of the largest economies in the world. And so this is a list of GDP by country. If Taiwan were a country, it would be ranked 21 right after Switzerland. And one of the large kind of Taiwanese firms that's in the news all the time is this company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, better known as TSMC. And I'll talk a little bit about why TSMC is important and how it ties into these geopolitical kind of issues. If we break down the semiconductor industry, we see that there are different kinds of semiconductor manufacturers, and these are color coded in this chart from Bloomberg. You'll see that TSMC is one of the few companies that is entirely in pink, and that means it's a foundry. What is a foundry? In this process of chip manufacturing, a foundry is a manufacturer that specializes only in manufacturing. So it doesn't do any design, it doesn't do any testing. It only does one thing. It just manufactures chips. And what does is it allows for firms to specialize in a certain aspect of manufacturing and allows them to look for a company like TSMC to do all of the hard manufacturing aspects at a low cost and at high yields. And so it allows for a very particular specialization that actually creates a lot of profits for semiconductor companies. You can see that as a result, most semiconductor manufacturers have moved away from a model where they do everything in-house, so where they do design and manufacturing testing, and instead they focus just on design. So the big American firms like NVIDIA, AMD, Broadcom, Qualcomm, these are companies that have shifted exclusively to design. So they focus on having their engineers come up with these designs, and then they give these contracts to companies like TSMC to manufacture these chips. Those firms are then called they're called fabless firms, meaning that they don't have fabrication facilities. You see that so many of the companies that are TSMC clients are fabless firms that we know well. So Qualcomm, NVIDIA, Broadcom, Apple, and there's a recent excellent book by historian Chris Miller called Chip War, and the way that he describes it, the evolution towards fabless manufacturing, he says he uses the example of NVIDIA, which is one of the biggest kind of fabless semiconductor firms out there. Today, NVIDIA's chips, largely manufactured by TSMC, are found in most advanced data centers. It's a good thing the company didn't need to build its own fab. At the startup stage, it would have probably been impossible to raise necessary sums. Giving a couple $1 million to chip designers working in a Denny's was already a gamble. Betting over $100 million, the cost of a new fab at the time would have been a stretch even for Silicon Valley's most adventurous investors. And so what he's referring to here is that NVIDIA was basically started in a Denny's. It was, a couple engineers came together, they came up with the idea for it, and they got a couple $1 million in investment. The only way they could have done that is if they were fabless, because if they needed to build their own fab, that number would have been 3 digits higher. 3 digits higher? 2 digits higher, two additional zeros. Okay. Um, the result is that uh, in the fabless model, where there's foundries that focus on manufacturing, TSMC actually is almost I mean, not quite a monopoly, but it's close to there. 54% of the foundry market is occupied by TSMC, and it's by far the largest manufacturer. And if you break it down by the type of chip, so by lithography, the smaller the die size of the chip, the more advanced it is, the more difficult it is to manufacture at yield. If you look at this breakdown, chips under 10 nanometers, which are considered advanced chips, 92% of those are manufactured by TSMC. So that is basically monopoly. When you go down to 3 nanometers, which is the most advanced die size on the market today, that is close to 99.9% of chips are manufactured by TSMC. So that is a monopoly. Um, this means that the entire world is basically dependent upon Taiwan's supply chain and has led to what many observers call the so-called silicon shield. And this refers to the fact that TSMC's manufacturing is seen as integral, kind of a thing that you cannot lose in a war, and protects Taiwan geopolitically from conflict because everybody relies on TSMC's manufacturing for the world to function. And so here you have a quote from one of these researchers saying Taiwan's Silicon Shield makes it the 51st US state, which is a bold statement to make. The US needs to protect Taiwan. It can't afford to lose it to China. Taiwan recognizes this. So this is a quote from Wang Meihua, who is the Minister of Economic Affairs from Taiwan. She says Taiwan has a very important role in the semiconductor supply chain. We dominate the foundry area. Everyone needs more advanced semiconductors. Taiwan will be a key player in the world. And to make global more prosperity, that's a spelling error. I think will make Taiwan more safer. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of the US-China-Taiwan relationship? Well, we saw the reaction to this. We began to see it under the Trump administration. The Biden administration took it to become the CHIPS and Science Act, which was a massive effort by the US government to incentivize uh, multinational corporations to bring semiconductor manufacturing to US soil because this is seen as a critical dependency. And the result of the CHIPS Act is we see that TSMC is now building a fab in Arizona, which has also offered its own incentives for semiconductor manufacturing. The result of this is also, as a part of the CHIPS Act, as a part of what began under the Trump administration, the U.S.-China trade war, has been sanctions on Chinese firms, which are seen as national security kind of weaknesses. And so this doesn't extend just to American firms. It also extends to all firms that do business with the United States, including TSMC and another major player in the semiconductor manufacturing industry called ASML, which is a Netherlands manufacturer of what's called extreme ultraviolet lithography, which is they're machines used to build the machines that make semiconductors. And ASML is basically the only company that makes them. And without access to ASML, without access to TSMC, Chinese chip makers have been caught in a difficult situation because they depend on those for their supply chains. And so it's had an effect on China as well. This is also interesting because it's now filtered into presidential politics. Just a couple weeks ago, the presidential candidate for the Republican nomination, Vivek Ramaswamy, came out with his Taiwan policy. And it's an interesting Taiwan policy because he states that he will declare strategic clarity, meaning, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, meaning that the United States will make a clear commitment to defend Taiwan in the case of Chinese military action. But under Ramaswamy's plan, it will only do so until the United States achieves so-called semiconductor independence. And then after that point, in a very pragmatic move, it will then move back to strategic ambiguity. Um, we'll talk about why this is kind of a problematic positioning. I think it's a bit naive in multiple directions. I think it misunderstands strategic clarity, strategic ambiguity. But the most fundamental misconception is the idea that the United States can gain so-called semiconductor independence. It will not be possible based on the current supply chains. And I don't think it will be possible to fully extricate the United States from Taiwan unless you want to basically pay multiple premiums over the current costs. And the reason why TSMC is so integrated is because it can offer chips at such a low cost at a high yield and with pretty good IP law, intellectual property law security. Um, and there's no competitor that can offer that. Even in the United States, we're talking about margins that would be like 2 to 3 times the cost of that. And at those margins, U.S. companies are unwilling to basically purchase at those costs unless it's really critical kind of semiconductors. Um, and so I think this is kind of a naive notion. We can talk more about this in the Q&A. Okay, the other I mentioned I wanted to talk about 2 case studies. The other one focuses on check the time. I will try to wrap up in about 5 minutes. The other focuses on a kind of question to this, and it focuses on the Taiwan-China relationship. So China is Taiwan's largest trading partner by far. It's it, the trade between Taiwan and China is multiple times that of the trade between the United States and Taiwan. And so because of that, we see a great deal of integration between Taiwan and Chinese supply chains. And I think that Terry Guo, the presidential candidate who's just come out and thrown his hat into the race, is a perfect example because he runs Foxconn, which is a company that is deeply dependent on China. This is kind of an old Bloomberg breakdown, but it's still nonetheless accurate. It shows the origin and the different subcontractors, sub-manufacturers that manufacture all different parts of the Apple iPhone. The biggest one is Foxconn, of course, which assembles all the iPhones, most of them in central China. And we see this in this breakdown of all the different Foxconn manufacturing facilities. Those big blue circles are the ones that are the Foxconn facilities that assemble the iPhones. The biggest ones being in Zhengzhou, right there in the center of mainland China. And so you see that Taiwan is highly dependent on China for not just Foxconn, but all these other industries where Taiwanese firms utilize cheap Chinese labor in order to gain a price advantage. And we're seeing a condition now where, because of geopolitics, because of the Thai administration's new southbound policy, which is encouraging Taiwanese firms to go south, meaning to go to Southeast Asia, to move their supply chains into Vietnam, into Malaysia, into Indonesia. Um, we're seeing a shift in Taiwan's economic size, where now many Chinese firms are pushing to move to Southeast Asia, partially for economic reasons where China's labor costs are rising, but also for political reasons because they're afraid of political risk of potential future conflict. And so we see that Vietnam is an increasing source of exports to the United States because so many firms are moving their supply chains to Vietnam. Okay, 2 more minutes thinking about the future. Um, a couple important things to note when we think about Taiwan's current international situation. One is its increasing international isolation. So most recently, in March of this year, Honduras ended its diplomatic relationship with the Republic of China, with Taiwan. And it's under the so-called, one China policy that Beijing enforces. Beijing will not allow countries that have a relationship with it to also at the same time recognize the Republic of China. And so they must choose one China to recognize. And so over the years, since Tsai Ing-wen has come to power in 2016, Beijing has picked up different diplomatic allies. Allies isn't the right word. Different countries that have recognized Taipei in the past have switched recognition to Beijing. So in the past 7 years, it's been the Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Nicaragua, and most recently Honduras have now recognized Beijing in lieu of Taipei. And so 17 nations, when this graphic was created, has now dwindled to 13. And so this is part of an effort of Beijing to isolate Taiwan internationally and to kind of reduce its international influence. Taiwan is taking steps to kind of, hedge its bets. One of these is to build relationships with other states that are not recognized as states. And so Taiwan has now exchanged embassies, de facto embassies, with Somaliland, which is also a state that isn't recognized internationally, and has also changed its naming of an office in Lithuania. It has an office in the United States. the Taiwanese consulates and embassies are not called Taiwanese consulates and embassies. They're called something like the Taipei Economic Cultural Office or the Taipei Economic Cultural Representative Office. So it's never using the name Taiwan or even Republic of China. Lithuania is the first country to host a Taiwan representative office, so just using the name Taiwan. And this resulted in a major political backlash from China. It kind of imposed a death penalty. It delisted Lithuania from its trade documentation so that Lithuanian companies could no longer do business in China. Uh, of course, only about 1% of Lithuania has any kind of trade relationship with China. So this is a case where it's a country that isn't dependent upon Chinese trade. But nonetheless, Beijing has exerted a great amount of pressure on Lithuania. And I think that that pressure might actually have had caused Lithuania to buckle were it not for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which really has actually pushed Lithuania in the opposite direction, and has really encouraged Lithuania to increase its relationship with Taiwan because it sees Taiwan as kind of a fellow, Baltic country, a small country that's under threat from a large neighbor, a large authoritarian neighbor. And that obviously has a lot to do with its history in the Soviet Union and its occupation by Russia. Okay, final aspect is strategic ambiguity. Um, Vivek Ramaswamy, a few minutes ago, I mentioned, came out with that, his Taiwan policy of strategic clarity until semiconductor independence. Strategic ambiguity refers to a long-standing U.S. informal policy towards Taiwan, meaning that the United States does not publicly lay out what it will do in the case of a military intervention of China to Taiwan. So if China were to declare war or were to begin some sort of military action, the United States officially doesn't have a clear policy of what it will do. And what this does is it creates essentially a great deal of flexibility for the United States to offer dual deterrence, meaning that it deters Beijing from acting unilaterally to upset the status quo. It also deters Taipei from acting unilaterally to upset the status quo. So it discourages Taiwan from having essentially carte blanche to do whatever it wants. So the hypothetical is that Taipei can declare itself the Republic of Taiwan and cross Beijing's red line. And so the idea is that without a clear commitment, Taipei is not incentivized to take reckless action. In recent years, 2020 was a notable year because Richard Haass and David Sachs. Richard Haass is the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, which is one of the most influential kind of think tanks in DC on foreign policy, argued for changing this decades-long policy of strategic ambiguity to what they call strategic clarity, meaning that the United States spells out clearly that it will defend Taiwan in the case of Chinese invasion. Um, this has been taken up by different parts of the US government, especially in Congress. There are lots of pro Taiwanese lawmakers who've said that the United States should take up strategic clarity. And most interestingly, in the past year or so, President Biden has made a number of public comments. At first, they were kind of like in informal venues, like a journalist asking, a question that's been asked, for decades: Will the United States defend Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion? And the answer is always, we it's an ambiguous answer. And then Biden last year began to give answers that were like, yes, we will. And that's not very ambiguous. So began to cause all sorts of alarm in DC and elsewhere about, is this a policy that's a change to strategic ambiguity? And the most publicly he said this was in a 60 Minutes interview. So this was publicly televised. This is obviously prepared in advance. And he stated, yes, the United States will send troops to defend Taiwan. Um, this is taken by some to be evidence of strategic clarity. I think it's still not strategic clarity just because it's not a change to the legal commitment that the United States has, which is outlined in the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. And the TRA is still ambiguous about what the United States policy is. So I think unless there's a change in the law, we're still operating under this paradigm of strategic ambiguity. But Biden has taken steps to make that ambiguity, I don't know, a little bit less unambiguous or maybe more ambiguous. I don't know. And so we return to Ramaswamy. I think that there is some element of the Republican Party that might be more willing to do away with ambiguity, as evidenced by Ramaswamy. And so we'll see if this might change with the upcoming primary election. So we'll see who will become the candidate. If it's Trump, Trump has always been very instrumentalist. I think that he doesn't see Taiwan as anything more than an object. I think Ramaswamy clearly sees Taiwan as an object. There are others who are more ideological about it. So if Marco Rubio, for example, were running, he's not, but if he were, he would be much more ideological about it. I think that he sees Taiwan as something akin to Cuba. So we'll see a different range of responses from the Republican wing of, the foreign policy establishment. And so keep an eye on that as we go into 2024. Okay, I'll stop here. I think I've gone over time. So happy to answer questions.
East Asia